Hi, I'm Dr. Hall Patton, or Cypher on this channel, and I've been teaching a course on religion in American history. A defining group of events in that narrative are the Great Awakenings. We've had 4 of them thus far in the United States, or predecessor colonies, each defined by a pious reaction to changing times. That causes increasing evangelism and eventually attempts at reviving Christianity among Americans or colonists, which gains significant popularity. As the awakening progresses, new movements form or split, but eventually the fervor of revivals burns itself out, driving people away from faith instead of bringing them in. So many of our various sects and denominations either started because of a Great Awakening or were transformed by one. They represent an increase in religiosity, as in strong belief. But it still seems that there hasn't been much of an analysis of Great Awakenings as a whole. You can see my bibliography contains works on some of these, but none altogether. I think we can learn something by putting these in conversation with each other, because there's a chance that we are living through a 5th Great Awakening. By studying how these events came to be and what unifies them, we can understand the pattern and perhaps recognize whether we are going through another, along with what that means for the future. Religion has been an incredibly important part of American history, and to understand that, you have to understand the Great Awakenings. By the beginning of the 18th century, the British colonies in North America had experienced a significant decline in religiosity. Disillusionment, political upheaval, and economic transformation had followed a series of conflicts decades prior. King Philip's War stoked ethnic tensions between natives and New Englanders. Planters turned to slavery instead of indentured servitude because of Bacon's Rebellion. The Dominion of New England fell apart, allowing mercantilism to blossom. Congregants saw through the hateful destruction of the Salem witch trials, and 2 intercolonial wars allowed the British to dominate the triangle trade. The established religions of Puritanism in the North, or Anglicanism in the South, were struggling to make these changes meaningful, especially as more colonists began to follow the secular ideas of the Enlightenment. But a movement would soon sweep the colonies to revive their faith. A combination of several theologies gained prominence in England, which emphasized commitment to God not only through piety, but through feeling, called evangelism. There was a series of small revivals throughout the colonies just after the War of Spanish Succession concluded in 1713, trying to bring back what they had lost, but these didn't have the evangelism that defines a Great Awakening. Back in England, the Holy Club formed in 1729, with the express intent of encouraging belief through vigorous missionary work. They taught that humanity was totally depraved, naturally and fundamentally evil, and that God had already chosen who would go to heaven or hell before they were born, a doctrine known as double predestination. The Holy Club would develop into Methodism, though they would later reject double predestination. The founding Methodists absolutely believed in it, such as the Wesley brothers and George Whitefield, who came to the colonies in the 1730s to preach that without conversion, people had proven themselves to be damned. This fire and brimstone preaching characterizes revivals. Other denominations would take on evangelical ethos from the Holy Club. Congregationalist Jonathan Edwards started holding revivals and claiming we are all sinners in the hands of an angry God. Therefore, let everyone that is out of Christ not awake and flee from the wrath to come. The wrath of Almighty God is now undoubtedly hanging over every unregenerate sinner. Those who took on evangelical revivalism were New Lights, and those who thought it defied their interpretation of Christianity were Old Lights. Great Awakenings inevitably cause splits because of these differences, meaning there will inevitably be new religious movements caused by these revivals and social upheavals, American Methodism being the major export of the first one. Awakenings are also inherently reactions to a perceived loss of religiosity, meaning they are a populist response to established politics. In the first one, women became more prominent members of their congregations, prompting more civil engagement and opposition to coverture laws, as in the laws that made women property of their husbands or fathers and never allowing them to have property. Evangelists sought to convert slaves, which would incidentally lend a biblical reason for abolition, since there are specific passages opposed to long-term enslavement of Hebrews, which most Christians believed applied to themselves. Finally, the new light of populism caused a distance from the old light of seminary schools, which were the most prominent part of academia in the 18th century. But all Great Awakenings fade away eventually. The first one reached its climax in the early 1740s. A revivalist named James Davenport organized public burnings of books that encouraged Enlightenment ideas. He wanted people to add their ostentatious belongings to the flames as well. For a couple years, people actually followed him, indulging these bonfires of the vanities, at least until he threw his pants into the fire. Seriously, he just ripped off his pants and threw it in a blaze. Rapidly, revivals of the First Great Awakening withered away as people grew tired of this craziness. Evangelism and attempted revivals continued, but they were simply nowhere close to as popular as they were during the Great Awakening. The Second Great Awakening would begin a half-century later. In between were 2 more intercolonial wars and an entire revolution. The colonies gained their independence, founding a republic based on the very Enlightenment principles that Davenport had tried to burn out of existence. The United States Constitution emphasized a secular government formed through a social contract rather than religious piety. No, it had nothing to do with Judeo-Christian values. That's just nonsense. Many states even quickly disestablished their denominations. Romanticism in Europe challenged the Enlightenment, and many Americans felt that the new country had gone too far astray from their religion. Unitarians became dominant among Congregationalists, eventually becoming the primary theology at Harvard in 1805, causing Trinitarians to form their own separate college. Methodists split from the British Church before that, but split again because of excluding black clergy, and once again when their first bishop seemed to be too dominant. So there was a lack of old light and evangelical authority, compounding concerns about lacking piety. And all this just as Americans began to expand beyond the Appalachians in significant numbers.
An army of the worst dregs ever to soil the face of the West. Bulldykes, train robbers, bank robbers, ass-kickers, shit-kickers, and Methodists!
Several revival movements began, attempting to restore Christianity back to what they thought were its primitive origins, devoid of centuries' worth of corruption and secularization. The first of these were in frontier camps, beginning in Kentucky, perfectly coinciding with the start of the 19th century. This Great Awakening took a couple decades to catch on. Evangelizing the West became a key way to spread the revivals, with the American Bible Society forming in 1816. Especially as the United States began to industrialize, people formed communes trying to avoid rising capitalism with religious socialism, starting in 1817 with Zoar, Ohio. Numerous new religious movements began during this with the belief of restoring a more primitive church. There was holiness, which called practitioners to practice radical perfectionism to prove a second act of grace, thereby proving that they've been graced by God and will go to heaven. Transcendentalism split from Unitarians, calling for life in accordance with nature. Mormonism added books to the Bible and called for a gathering to a Zion inside the United States, eventually heading deep into the Great Basin to avoid further persecution once Illinoisans lynched their prophet and his brother. William Miller claimed that the advent of Christ's second coming would soon end the world, leading to some disappointments when that prediction didn't come true. And then there'd be splits once more as those further predictions didn't come to pass. Political issues ended the Second Great Awakening. Many Northerners endorsed abolitionism. Beginning in 1830, the Liberator newspaper used the whole issue with enslaving Christians to justify their absolutist position. This liberation theology began to affect every denomination. Baptists split over slavery in 1840, Methodists in 1845, and Presbyterians in 1857. During that, an 1848 convention in Seneca Falls, led by Quakers and Unitarians, called for women's suffrage and an end to coverture laws. The Second Great Awakening ended with all this tumult, especially when the country invaded Mexico and annexed the Southwest, causing a sectional crisis over the expansion of slavery and ultimately the Civil War. Throughout that period, revivals failed to gain traction, save for one batch in 1858, proving that the Second Great Awakening had come to an end. The third one was less distinct from the first and second. Revivals grew in popularity after the Civil War. People felt lost after so much death and destruction. Plus, the political issues of Reconstruction kept Americans attacking each other. They sought refuge. Seances and other kinds of spiritualism spread like wildfire, but it didn't really start a major movement for some time. Theosophy joined esoteric thought with Eastern mysticism to form a nexus of occultism and spiritualist groups. Christian Science began in 1879 believing that the material world was mere illusion, and prayer was the only way to be saved. A businessman named Moody started an institute to spread dispensationalism in 1886, as in the belief that there are multiple eras that the Bible specifies and we are living through the last, requiring particular things to cause the apocalypse. Pentecostalism grew out of the holiness movement with a third act of grace represented through speaking in tongues, and their revivals began in 1900. The Third Great Awakening coalesced around three political movements of the late 19th and early 20th century. Calls for voluntary abstinence from alcoholic drinks, aka temperance, or even prohibition had several organizations begin in the late 19th century, gaining a constitutional amendment in 1919. That same year, suffragettes finally achieved their goal after much expansion following the Second Great Awakening. But the most significant cause of the Third Great Awakening was the social gospel. It was the theological doctrine that Christians should take an active part in fighting for social justice, especially using New Testament calls for compassion and love. The social gospel fed into the rise of progressivism, leading to the theological justification for that political ideology, which would define the early 20th century. The Third Great Awakening died just as progressivism became prominent, though. Advances in technology and scientific knowledge challenged many Christian assumptions, requiring denominations to either modernize or conserve fundamental principles. Most prominent of these contradictions was how to interpret evolution. Fundamentalists thought it contradicted the Bible, and they'd hold on to that with dear life. They're called creationists now because they have denied reality so much that they're basically just bigots. While modernists didn't believe in their interpretation of the Bible and its inerrancy, or even literalism. This acrimony between fundamentalists and modernists halted the popularity of revivals. exemplified best by the 1925 Scopes trial, where Tennessee had officially prohibited evolution in public school curricula. Challenging that in a show trial between two prominent lawyers, the prosecutor embarrassed himself with how little scripture he actually knew, but still won due to the law mandating indoctrinating students into scientific ignorance. But evangelists found a new venue during the interwar years: the radio. Preachers could reach wide audiences through broadcasting. So while the Third Awakening died, the next lay in wait thanks to technology. The fourth and final confirmed one began in the 1960s. Before that, the United States participated in 2 world wars and was in the midst of an international rivalry with another superpower called the Cold War. After World War II, more Americans were church members than before or since. They sought community after so much death and destruction. Much like after the Civil War, religion has a powerful ability to bring people together. It is perhaps its most important aspect. But the Cold War also made people seek ideological purity, using religion to denounce their political opponents. Hence the addition of "In God We Trust" to our money and "Under God" to our Pledge of Allegiance. On top of that, Jim Crow had arisen after Reconstruction, and the national mobilization of these wars strained that segregation and disenfranchisement almost to the breaking point. Desegregation began with 2 executive orders, one desegregating defense industries and the other the military itself. The Supreme Court ruled that schools had to desegregate, and then a year later, a small effort to desegregate busing gained success, led by a Baptist preacher named Martin Luther King. Through his Southern Christian Leadership Conference, a new form of liberation theology infused the movement for civil rights. Many other groups joined the struggle, successfully dismantling Jim Crow, causing immigration reform, and supporting religious freedom for tribe members through legislation. Other such movements unsuccessfully sought equal rights for women and queer liberation. Protests instead began to focus on peace in Vietnam. The counterculture arose during all of this. Hippies often created religiously motivated communes, and other waves of spiritualism reinforced much of the counterculture's ideology, exemplified by New Ageism, the weird spiritual stuff that you see a lot of hippie types get into. Many dangerous cults formed around all this, such as the People's Temple that led to the Jonestown Massacre. But more exemplary were groups of restorationists who sought to spread the gospel through participation in liberation movements, thereby evangelizing in the streets, often derogatorily called Jesus freaks. But the Fourth Great Awakening came to be defined by a backlash to liberation. Conservatives became more and more dominant in evangelicalism throughout this time. Some of the radio preachers switched to TV after the war. Televangelists initially sided with liberation theology, but most became more fundamentalist over time, leading to constant and popular denouncements of the counterculture and eventually liberation itself, which all played into a religious backlash to social progress. After school desegregation, many groups formed private schools that wouldn't admit black students, often using Christianity as an excuse for racism. Since the Supreme Court ruled the frankly obvious fact that mandating students pray in public schools is a massive violation of the First Amendment, which was yet another McCarthyite measure. Evangelicals pretended this somehow eliminated voluntary prayer as well in order to create their segregation academies, a lie that persists today. The Supreme Court ruled against segregation academies in 1976. School choice remains a key issue for right-wing evangelicals. Another Supreme Court case rankled fundamentalists. Roe v. Wade proclaimed that women have a constitutional right to their own bodily autonomy and therefore could expect abortions within certain time limits. Catholics and evangelicals opposed that, making it a key issue by the end of the 1970s. They also opposed the Equal Rights Amendment and queer liberation, turning their bigotry into a crusade for so-called decency. So throughout the Fourth Great Awakening, there was a distinct change from this liberation theology over to the evangelical right. And 1979 was the culminating moment. Even though both presidents LBJ and Carter were evangelicals, right-wingers opposed the culture that those politicians supposedly supported. Southern Baptists held a convention that pushed out the modernists in favor of fundamentalists. Jerry Falwell founded the Moral Majority, which campaigned for cultural regression to some imagined traditional values. Many other groups like that followed. They all sided with Ronald Reagan, who promised to aid in their backlash against civil rights, winning the presidency in 1980. Fundamentalists understandably saw this as a massive victory, igniting a culture war that remains with us today. Moderates and progressives felt that their religion had been taken over by the very hatred they thought Christianity was supposed to oppose. Where was the love that Jesus preached? Revivals continued, but church attendance fell precipitously. More and more people lost their faith in organized religion, with roughly 28% of Americans identifying as religious nuns as of 2020, meaning they are unaffiliated, agnostic, atheist, independently spiritual, or some other form of irreligious. Scholars endlessly argue about why nuns have grown so much since the 80s, but the rise of the evangelical right backfired and ended the Fourth Great Awakening. They actually caused a reduction in religiosity. So with all this history in mind, let's return to that question I asked in the beginning. Are we living through a Fifth Great Awakening? We can see some key characteristics in each of the past ones. First, there's a reaction to changing times, which causes increasing evangelism and eventually attempts at reviving Christianity among Americans, which gains significant popularity. As the awakening progresses, new movements form or split, but eventually the fervor of revivals burns itself out, driving people away from faith instead of bringing them in. But ultimately, the definition depends completely on people talking about it after the fact. We can predict what historians will call the present, but it is merely a prediction. My guess is that we are not in a Fifth Great Awakening. Religious nuns are still growing. Fundamentalists continue to whine about the same nonsense they have for decades. What new movements are forming? Where's these popular revivals? But there's another way to look at it. The longest period between Great Awakenings was 60 years, and the shortest 20. It's been 40 since the last. Megachurches could be seen as revivals, and those are growing.
I execute judgment on you, COVID-19. I demand a vaccination to come immediately.
Yes.
It is over. And the United States of America is healed and well.
Thank you.
New movements always took a while to develop, and we are certainly hearing plenty of fundamentalists calling for the reestablishment of traditional values. With so many religious nuns and the continuation of the culture war, maybe the whole MAGA movement could be seen as a new sect, complete with its own cult of personality. And this whole thing is like a reverse of previous Great Awakenings, where it goes from political to religious change, rather than the other way around. I don't know what the future holds, no one can. So, what do you think? Are we living through a Fifth Great Awakening, or are we not? Let me know in the comments. And I'll see you guys in the next one. Also, if you want to support the channel, there's always Patreon or buying some merch like this, where it says, by decree of King Richard I, because he always interrupts. Ooh, he tried to get away. Hi. Oh, thank you. There we go. That's what I wanted. Kitty kisses. Good boy. As in a king. Religiosity. Meow. Meow. As in king. Yeah, you don't like the enslavement of Christians, do you? Your namesake fought against that specifically. Yeah. Really didn't like that. I guess you don't either. Yes. Oh. Dispensationalism. That's a difficult word to say. Requiring denunciations, denominations. God damn it. If you don't want to be picked up, don't meow. Hey. What are you doing? Meow. Hi. Reinforce. Meow. Say hello. Say hello.